The desert night was still, the wind whispering across dry sagebrush. A coyote's howl pierced the silence, and then came the sharp crack of a gunshot, tearing the peace apart. James Carter said, "The past won't let me be." His hand trembled over the revolver's worn grip as smoke curled into the moonlit sky. He stood alone, boots sunk in dust, eyes haunted by memories of betrayal. The flickering lantern by the saloon door painted shadows that danced like ghosts of men long gone. Inside, whispers grew tense, gamblers freezing mid-play. A woman's scream followed, shrill and raw, shattering the heavy air. James Carter said, "It starts tonight." The echo of his words bled into the silence, broken only by the restless shuffle of horses tied outside. The outlaw's chest rose and fell, breath heavy with regret. His heart thundered like hooves across the canyon, carrying him toward a fate he could not outrun. James Carter walked the dusty street, boots echoing like thunderclaps in the silence. He carried the weight of regret, every step dragging him deeper into a fate he despised. The townsfolk hid behind shutters, whispers rising like restless ghosts. The saloon door creaked open, spilling faint light onto the dirt road. James Carter said, "The law never saved me, and it won't save them." His voice was steady but hollow, carrying the echo of a man broken by loss. Sheriff Dalton watched from the shadows, eyes sharp as knives, while the night swallowed the town in dread. Inside the saloon, Elena Marquez steadied her trembling hands on the table, her scream still echoing in her chest. The gamblers whispered, eyes darting to the door where the outlaw stood moments earlier. William Hayes said, "That man carries more ghosts than bullets." His words were heavy, a truth too raw to ignore. The whiskey in his glass trembled with his scarred hand. Elena Marquez said, "He carries death with him." Her emerald eyes burned with a mix of fear and something else she dared not name. The wind howled harder outside, rattling shutters and doors. James Carter stood in the middle of the street, staring up at the moon. His chest heaved, memories of betrayal bleeding through his silence. He remembered fire, gunshots, and the scream of his brother years ago. James Carter said, "This town will know the truth before dawn." His shadow stretched long and broken, as though even the light did not trust him. Sheriff Dalton finally stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel, his polished badge catching moonlight. His lips curved into a cold smile. Sheriff Dalton said, "Some ghosts deserve no peace." James Carter's hand twitched near his revolver, eyes fixed on the man who had once sworn justice. Between them, the night thickened, silent as a gallows rope. Morning light spilled across the desert, painting the town in weary gold. James Carter sat alone on a weathered bench outside the saloon, revolver resting heavy in his lap. His eyes carried the scars of countless nights, restless and unforgiving. James Carter said, "Every sunrise feels like a curse." The street was quiet, but shutters creaked as fearful eyes peered out. The past clung to him like dust that no wind could sweep away. He remembered a family once, laughter that had turned to silence, and the betrayal that followed. Elena Marquez stepped out of the saloon, her voice soft, almost fragile. Elena Marquez said, "You can't keep running from ghosts." He did not look at her, for the weight of her words was heavier than the gun in his hands. The town waited, as though it already knew the storm was coming. Elena Marquez moved closer, her heels clicking against wood, her shadow stretching beside his. She leaned toward him, whispering words like secrets meant for no one else. Elena Marquez said, "Dalton owns this town, James. He won't let you leave alive." He turned slowly, meeting her gaze with eyes hardened by regret. James Carter said, "Then I'll leave him bleeding in the dust." Her breath caught, but she did not step away. The weight of her loyalty, torn between two men, settled heavy in the air. A rider passed slowly, glancing at them with suspicion, the kind only a frightened town could breed. Above, the sun rose higher, burning away shadows but not their sins. Inside the sheriff's office, Dalton polished his badge, its gleam reflecting the cold satisfaction in his eyes. Sheriff Dalton said, "Fear keeps order, not law." Behind him, wanted posters fluttered as the door cracked open. His deputy shuffled in nervously, holding a crumpled note. The words scratched across the page spelled defiance. Dalton smirked, folding the note neatly. Sheriff Dalton said, "Carter wants war." He rose, his boots heavy against the wooden floorboards. The lawman's authority was not justice. It was control wrapped in iron and blood. He holstered his revolver with deliberate calm, the steel echoing like a death knell. William Hayes leaned against the saloon bar, his scar catching the lantern glow. His eyes were tired, carrying the burden of truths unspoken. William Hayes said that boys walking into a grave. He poured whiskey, but did not drink, his hand trembling. Elena Marquez stood across, defiance softening into worry. Elena Marquez said, "You trained him. You gave him the fire that burns in his veins." William Hayes shook his head, the weight of guilt pressing down like years of dust. William Hayes said, "I gave him my mistakes, and mistakes have teeth." James Carter stood at the edge of town, staring across the vast desert. The horizon shimmered with heat, yet the cold in his chest was sharper than any wind. He pulled his revolver free, staring at its steel. James Carter said, "Every road leads me back here." Behind him, the town seemed small, fragile against the endless land. The memories of betrayal coiled tighter, choking every breath. He closed his eyes, hearing again the gunshot that had stolen his brother. He whispered to the desert, words meant for no one but himself. James Carter said, "This time, I finish it." The sun beat down on the desert, heat rippling across the sand. James Carter stood at the well, filling his canteen, though his eyes scanned every shadow. Danger lingered, unseen yet heavy. William Hayes leaned against the fence, his voice rough with age. William Hayes said, "You are fighting a war you can't win, boy." James Carter said, "I'm not fighting to win, I'm fighting to finish." The old man frowned, but the fire in James' words burned too strong. The town seemed to shrink in silence, waiting for its reckoning. Inside the saloon, Elena Marquez paced across the floor, her heels clicking in nervous rhythm. Gamblers watched in silence, sensing her unrest. She gripped the table edge, voice low and sharp. Elena Marquez said, "Dalton has men in every shadow." Her eyes darted toward the door, waiting for it to burst open. Fear and defiance warred inside her. She whispered again, softer this time. Elena Marquez said, "James will not survive this unless he sees the trap." Sheriff Dalton gathered his deputies in the dusty yard behind the jailhouse. His polished badge gleamed in the sun as he laid out his plan. Sheriff Dalton said, "We strike at dusk. Carter walks into the noose tonight." His deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but his authority was iron. Dalton smirked, tightening his gloves. He said, "Fear keeps this town alive, and I am fear." The men nodded reluctantly, bound by loyalty or fear, while shadows grew long across the dirt. James Carter leaned against the stable wall, sweat glistening on his brow. The horses stirred uneasily, sensing his unrest. He closed his eyes, hearing again the scream of his brother and the betrayal that had stolen his peace. James Carter said, "Every step brings me closer to him." His voice cracked, but resolve remained. He opened his eyes, steel glinting in their depth. The weight of the past pressed down, yet he straightened, determined to carry it into battle. William Hayes sat at the bar, his glass untouched, eyes clouded by guilt. He whispered to himself, though the words carried weight. William Hayes said, "I should have stopped him years ago." Elena Marquez overheard, her expression tightening. She stepped closer, her voice sharp with urgency. Elena Marquez said, "If you don't stand with him, he'll stand alone, and Dalton will bury him." Silence fell heavy, as if the saloon itself held its breath, waiting for the choice to be made. The evening sun bled into the desert sky, painting the horizon in fire and ash. James Carter stood at the edge of town, staring toward Dalton's office, his face drawn tight with resolve. The sound of boots echoed behind him, but he did not turn. Elena Marquez approached slowly, her eyes flashing with secrets long buried. Elena Marquez said, "You think Dalton is your only enemy?" Her voice trembled, caught between defiance and guilt. James Carter said, "What are you hiding, Elena?" The silence stretched, heavier than the desert heat. She lowered her gaze, whispering words that cut deeper than any blade. Elena Marquez said, "Dalton isn't your enemy alone. He's your brother's killer, and I helped him cover it." The world stilled, wind falling silent, the weight of betrayal breaking Carter's breath into shards. The revelation hit James like a bullet. His breath quickened, chest tight as rage warred with grief. He stepped back, hand twitching near his revolver, but his voice cracked more than it threatened. James Carter said, "You knew. All these years you knew." Elena Marquez closed her eyes, tears streaking her cheeks, but no words came. William Hayes appeared from the saloon doorway, his weathered face grim. William Hayes said, "It's true, James. I knew too. I kept it from you, thinking I could spare you." The silence of the street turned suffocating, every sound swallowed by the storm building inside Carter's heart. His voice shook, each word a knife. James Carter said, "You all betrayed me." Inside Dalton's office, the sheriff smiled coldly as a deputy whispered the chaos outside. Sheriff Dalton said, "Good. Let them destroy each other before I lift a hand." He leaned back in his chair, boots on desk, revolver gleaming in the lamplight. His polished badge caught the fire of the lantern, but it was his eyes that burned with ambition. Sheriff Dalton said, "Carter thinks he's chasing justice. He's only chasing my shadow." The deputy shifted uneasily, but Dalton's smirk deepened. Outside, the storm of betrayal gathered strength, and Dalton sat calm, a spider waiting in his web. James Carter stormed into the stable, fists clenched, fury etched into every movement. Horses reared nervously, sensing the fire in his veins. He gripped the wooden beam, splinters digging into his palm, grounding himself against collapse. William Hayes followed, his voice low and weary. William Hayes said, "I thought silence would save you, but it only damned us all." James Carter spun, eyes wild, the pain of betrayal sharper than any blade. James Carter said, "You were the one I trusted most. You were supposed to guide me, not bury me in lies." The words hung heavy, the bond between them breaking like brittle wood. Elena Marquez sat alone at the bar, her hands shaking as she poured whiskey. She stared into the amber liquid, as though it might wash away her sins. Her reflection wavered in the glass, fractured and broken. Elena Marquez said, "He'll never forgive me." The gamblers had left, the saloon empty except for her trembling shadow. She lifted the glass but set it down again, unable to drink. Her voice cracked as she whispered into the silence. Elena Marquez said, "I chose survival over truth, and now both will kill me." The lantern sputtered above, casting her in light and darkness all at once. The sun sank low, painting the sky in blood and fire. James Carter stepped into the middle of the street, boots sinking into dust, revolver heavy at his side. Every shutter closed, townsfolk hiding behind trembling boards. Sheriff Dalton appeared at the far end, his polished badge gleaming like a curse in the dying light. Sheriff Dalton said, "It ends tonight, Carter." James Carter's jaw tightened, his scar catching the last glow of the sun. James Carter said, "It ends with the truth." The silence thickened, broken only by the restless snort of a horse. Two men, bound by bloodshed and betrayal, stood ready to carve history into the dirt. William Hayes emerged from the saloon, the weight of years pressing against his steps. His voice was low, carrying across the tense air. William Hayes said, "Blood doesn't wash away blood, James." Carter didn't turn, eyes fixed on Dalton. James Carter said, "I've lived with ghosts long enough." The mentor's scarred face twisted with regret, but he did not step closer. Dalton smirked, his confidence unshaken, his hand hovering near his holster. Sheriff Dalton said, "One shot, Carter. That's all it takes to end your curse." The dying sun stretched their shadows across the dust, binding them in fate. Elena Marquez stepped onto the porch, her red dress catching the last rays of the sun. Her voice cracked, but it carried with desperate urgency. "Elena Marquez," said, "stop this madness. Both of you will die tonight." Neither man turned, their eyes locked in the silence of final judgment. Her tears caught the light, glinting like broken glass. James Carter said, "This is the only way." Dalton laughed, cold and sharp, his hand curling tighter over his revolver. Sheriff Dalton said, "She was always mine, Carter. You were too blind to see it." The words cut deep, deeper than bullets ever could. The wind howled through the street, carrying dust that swirled around their boots. William Hayes whispered, though the words were for himself. William Hayes said, "I should never have taught him to draw." The world seemed to hold its breath, time stretching thin as silence fell absolute. Dalton's fingers twitched near his weapon, his smirk carved in stone. James Carter's breath steadied, eyes narrowing, his soul laid bare in that instant. James Carter said, "This isn't for vengeance, this is for justice." The street became a stage for death, the audience unseen but trembling in every home. The draw came in a blur. Dalton's hand flashed to his revolver, steel glinting in the dying sun. Carter moved, too, faster than ghosts, the weight of loss fueling his fire. 2 gunshots cracked the silence, echoing like thunder through the desert. Dust exploded, and for a heartbeat no one breathed. Sheriff Dalton staggered, eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest. His smirk faded as he fell into the dust, badge catching one last gleam of light. James Carter stood shaking, revolver still smoking, eyes burning with both triumph and sorrow. He whispered, barely audible. James Carter said, "It's over." The silence after the duel was heavier than any gunshot. Dust drifted back to earth, covering Dalton's body as if the desert itself claimed him. The polished badge that once gleamed with authority lay dim, half buried in the dirt. James Carter stood frozen, revolver trembling in his hand, breath ragged as his heart hammered against his chest. The scar across his face looked deeper in the twilight, carved by years of grief. His victory felt hollow, an echo of justice that left him weaker, not stronger. William Hayes stepped off the porch, boots dragging through the dirt, his face shadowed with sorrow. William Hayes said, "You've won nothing, boy. All you've done is feed the graveyard." Carter's jaw clenched, rage and regret fighting for space in his chest. James Carter said, "Justice leaves no victors." From the saloon porch, Elena Marquez collapsed to her knees, sobs ripping from her chest as though the town itself wept through her. Behind shuttered windows, the townsfolk held their breath, praying the desert would bury this night forever. James Carter knelt in the dust, staring down at Dalton's lifeless face. His revolver slipped from his hand, hitting the dirt with a hollow thud. He reached for the badge pinned to Dalton's chest, its metal icy heavy with lies. His voice cracked like breaking timber. James Carter said, "This badge never made him a man, it only gave him a mask." He dropped it into the dirt, the clatter echoing like a coffin nail. William Hayes moved closer, laying a weathered hand on Carter's shoulder, his eyes red with guilt. William Hayes said, "Badges don't carry truth. Men do, and it breaks us." Carter rose slowly, dust clinging to his knees, shadows crawling across his scarred face. His chest burned with hollow triumph, his breath shallow, unsteady. From behind shuttered windows, townsfolk watched with wide eyes, whispering his name in fear and awe. The outlaw had defeated their lawman, but no peace came, only more ghosts crowding the silence. The saloon smelled of smoke and spilled whiskey, but silence ruled its air. Elena Marquez sat alone at the bar, her fingers trembling around a glass she could not drink. Her voice cracked, thin, and raw. Elena Marquez said, "I gave Dalton your brother's blood. I thought survival was worth the lie." James Carter stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor, long and jagged, more ghost than man. His silence was worse than bullets, worse than hate. She trembled, the red silk of her dress glowing like blood beneath the lantern light. Her hand shook as she pushed the glass away, the sound sharp in the hollow room. Elena Marquez said, "If you cannot forgive me, then I will live each day as if you buried me already." The lantern sputtered above, its flame shrinking before flaring again, throwing her face into both shadow and light. Carter's eyes blazed, but he spoke no word, his silence condemning her more deeply than any sentence could. James Carter walked slowly down the silent street, each step of his boots crunching gravel like a funeral march. Lanterns flickered faintly from behind shutters, frightened eyes watching from the safety of walls. William Hayes followed at a distance, shoulders bent by years of regret. His voice carried like a whisper against the night wind. William Hayes said, "Dalton's gone, but the poison he left behind won't die easy." Carter stopped in the middle of the road, his breath sharp, his scar catching the lantern glow like a wound carved in stone. James Carter said, "Then let the poison end with me." His words lingered, swallowed slowly by the wind that swept dust around his boots. Hayes lowered his head, guilt cutting deeper than old scars. The street stretched like a graveyard, shadows heavy, silence thick, every board and shutter whispering secrets. The outlaw's shadow stretched long into the night, scar across the town's memory, carved deeper with every step he took. At the town's edge, the desert stretched vast and merciless. James Carter stood motionless, his coat flapping in the cold wind, revolver hanging loosely in his grip, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the stars faded into endless night. Behind him, Elena Marquez walked slowly through the dust, her voice breaking as she called out. Elena Marquez said, "If you walk into that desert, you'll walk into it alone." Carter did not turn, his voice low and steady, carrying like iron. James Carter said, "I was born in shadows, Elena. I'll die in them too." He stepped forward, each stride pulling him farther from the faint lights of the town. Elena fell to her knees, tears streaking her face, sobs lost to the howl of the desert wind. William Hayes watched from a distance, his face carved with sorrow. The lanterns of the town flickered faintly, then dimmed, until only the desert claimed him. James Carter's figure grew smaller, then vanished into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but memory written in blood and dust. The desert night stretched endless, the stars sharp against the velvet black. James Carter sat by a dying campfire, the flames barely holding against the wind. His revolver lay on the dirt beside him, a silent reminder of the price he paid. William Hayes approached quietly, lowering himself with a weary groan. William Hayes said, "Men like us don't ride into peace, we ride into memory." Carter stared into the embers, their glow reflecting the fire still burning within. James Carter said, "Then let my memory be the last scar this town bears." The night swallowed his words, carrying them into the void. Elena Marquez sat alone in the saloon, the once lively room now hollow with silence. She traced the rim of her empty glass with trembling fingers, her reflection fractured in the surface. Her voice broke in the stillness. Elena Marquez said, "I betrayed him, but he carried me still." Her tears fell quietly, leaving stains darker than whiskey. Outside, the town whispered his name like a curse and a prayer both. She lifted her head, eyes burning through grief. Elena Marquez said, "James Carter will never be forgotten, even if he chooses to vanish." The lantern sputtered, casting shadows like ghosts across the wall. Sheriff Dalton's body was buried at dawn, the badge placed on his chest by trembling hands. The town gathered in silence, no tears shed, only the weight of fear lifted. William Hayes stood at the grave's edge, his voice low. William Hayes said, "Justice don't choose its heroes, it only buries the guilty." The crowd shifted uneasily, but none dared speak. James Carter watched from a distance, hidden in shadow, his face unreadable. He turned away before the last shovelful fell, knowing his name would never escape the town's whispering winds. James Carter saddled his horse at the edge of town, the desert wind tugging at his coat. The animal snorted, sensing the burden of its rider. Elena Marquez appeared, her voice soft, carrying across the morning air. Elena Marquez said, If you ride away, you ride alone. He turned, eyes tired but steady. James Carter said, I've always ridden alone. Her tears caught the sunlight, but she did not move closer. His hand lingered on the saddle, heavy with finality. The town behind them stood still, its silence a farewell no voice dared give. The horse's hooves struck the earth like a heartbeat as James Carter rode into the endless desert. His shadow stretched long behind him, swallowed by the rising sun. He did not look back, for the past was buried in blood and betrayal. William Hayes watched from the ridge, his voice carried by the wind. William Hayes said, the desert never forgets, but sometimes it forgives. Elena Marquez stood beside him, her face pale, eyes fixed on the horizon. The town remained behind, forever scarred, while the outlaw vanished into legend. The sun climbed higher, burning his memory into the sky.